The squad car sat angled across the center line, headlights still burning one of them. Val Johnson opened his eyes to the smell of hot metal and the sound of his own breathing. The windshield had a long, vertical crack running top to bottom on the driver's side, and something had struck the glass hard enough to leave 4 distinct impact points. His left eye felt as if someone had held a welding arc too close. When he tried to lift his head, the motion sent a slow wave of nausea through him. The radio was still on. He reached for the microphone with a hand that did not feel entirely his own. He keyed the transmitter and reported that he had been hit by something on County 5 near the intersection with 20. The words came out thicker than usual. Dispatch asked for his location and condition. Johnson told them the car had coasted to a stop and that he could not see well enough to drive. He did not say what had hit him. He did not yet know. The dashboard clock read 14 minutes behind the time he remembered last checking it. His wristwatch showed the same lag. Outside, the fields were dark and empty. No other vehicles moved on the road. He stayed in the seat, one hand still on the wheel, waiting for the sound of another siren. The second deputy arrived first, headlights sweeping across the stopped Ford LTD. He found Johnson still behind the wheel, moving slowly and shielding his eyes from the new light. Tire marks on the pavement showed a long, straight path rather than any sharp turn or collision skid. The car had come to rest sideways, grille pointed toward the south shoulder. Johnson described only that something had struck the vehicle and that his vision was impaired. The deputy called for an ambulance and stayed with him until help arrived. That first scene matters because nobody had time yet to turn the night into folklore. There was a hurt deputy, a county car sitting wrong on a rural highway, glass on the driver's side, and a radio log placing the call after a gap Johnson could not account for. The language stayed plain. He was not describing aliens. He was not selling a story. He was trying to explain why he was parked sideways in the dark with burned eyes and a patrol car that looked as if it had been hit from a direction no one could find. On an ordinary night shift, Johnson left the courthouse in Warren a little after midnight and drove north on Highway 75, then west onto the smaller county roads that cut between the sugar beet fields. The land there lies flat enough that a man can see the glow of a town 10 miles away on a clear night, yet the roads themselves stay empty after dark. County Highway 5 runs straight for miles, its gravel shoulders dropping away into drainage ditches. Johnson had driven the same stretch every night for months. He knew where the frost heaves were and which farmyards kept a yard light burning. At roughly 1:40 a.m., he noticed a bright white light low in the distance, perhaps 8 to 12 inches across and hovering a few feet above the ground. It did not pulse like a beacon and it did not move like a vehicle on the road. Johnson first thought it might be the landing light of a small plane in trouble. He turned left onto State Highway 220 to close the distance and get a better look. The light stayed ahead of him, steady in the dark. He kept his speed moderate, watching for any sign that the aircraft had touched down or was still descending. The fields on either side were black and silent. No farm lights showed between the rows of beets. Patrol procedure on those roads was simple and repetitive. Johnson drove with the windows down when the night was warm, listening for anything unusual over the sound of the tires. Radio traffic was light after midnight. Most calls came from the small towns or from farmers reporting livestock out. He had already checked the usual spots where teenagers parked and the intersections where deer crossed at dawn. The light he now followed did not fit any of those patterns. It held its height and brightness without wavering, and it gave no red or green navigation colors that would mark an airplane. He also had a practical reason to turn toward it. A deputy seeing a low light over a field near one of the roads does not have the luxury of treating it like a ghost story. It could be a downed crop duster, a vehicle off the road, a farm machine fire, or someone standing where no one should be standing at that hour. The place was close enough to the North Dakota line that a missed emergency could go quiet for a long time. So Johnson did the ordinary thing first. He changed roads, lined the car up with the light, and drove forward to identify it. The sources disagree slightly on the exact road language, which is common in cases that move from police notes into newspapers and then into memory. MNopedia places the patrol on County Highway 5 and the turn onto State Highway 220. Later local stories often compress that into the Highway 220 area near Warren or Stephen. The important part is the same in every version. Johnson was alone, the road was open, and the light was low enough that his first explanation was not outer space. It was an emergency close to the ground. The light did not remain distant. Johnson later said it closed the remaining distance in a matter of seconds, covering what he estimated to be more than a mile. One moment it sat low on the horizon, the next it filled the left side of the windshield. He heard glass break and felt a sudden pressure against his face and chest. The car lurched. He lost consciousness before he could lift his foot from the accelerator. When the car came to rest, it had traveled 854 feet from the point where the first damage appeared. It sat at a 90-degree angle to the direction of travel, the front end pointed toward the south shoulder. The engine had stalled. Johnson remained slumped behind the wheel until he regained awareness some time later. The interior smelled of scorched wiring and broken glass. The left headlight was shattered, The hood carried a small, flat-bottomed dent near the windshield. Both roof and trunk antennas were bent sharply, one at roughly 60 degrees, the other closer to 90. The hazard flasher switch had been knocked loose. Johnson touched his forehead and found a tender swelling. His eyes watered when he tried to focus on the gauges. He did not remember braking or steering the car into its final position. The long coasting marks on the pavement suggested the vehicle had continued forward under its own momentum for some distance after the initial contact. No other vehicles had passed during those minutes. The road remained empty in both directions. The fields on either side offered no cover and no witnesses. Johnson sat in the quiet car, trying to piece together what had just happened. The light that had been ahead of him on the road was no longer visible outside. Whatever had struck the left side of the vehicle had also left him disoriented and unable to account for the time that had passed. That is the part that keeps the story from becoming just another sighting. A light in a field can be misidentified, a tired deputy can mistake distance on a dark, flat road, a bright object can seem to jump when a vehicle is moving toward it. But the next thing in the record is not a memory of a strange shape fading into the sky. It is a disabled county car, physical damage, a deputy with eye injuries, and an elapsed time problem that both the car clock and his wristwatch seem to echo. The road gave investigators something to measure instead of only something to imagine. Johnson's own restraint is useful here. He did not add details that would make the story bigger. He did not describe windows in a craft, metal landing legs, beings in the ditch, or voices from the light. The version that survives is narrower and stranger. A bright object came at the patrol car. The glass broke. He blacked out. When he woke up, the evidence was sitting around him. He radioed at 2:19 a.m. The dispatcher recorded the time and the location. Johnson reported that he had been struck by an unknown object and that his vision was impaired. Another deputy was sent from Warren. When the second officer arrived, he found Johnson still in the driver's seat, moving slowly and speaking with effort. An ambulance was called. At the hospital, the examining physician noted irritation to both eyes consistent with exposure to intense light, a mild state of shock, and a contusion on the forehead. Johnson could not tolerate bright examination lights without pain. The two timepieces remained 14 minutes slow. Neither the wristwatch nor the car clock had been adjusted since the event. The car itself had not been moved. Tire marks showed a long, straight path of coasting rather than hard braking. No skid marks crossed the pavement at an angle that would suggest a collision with another vehicle. The left front fender and headlight assembly carried the only concentrated damage. The right side of the car showed nothing. Medical staff applied salve to Johnson's eyes and placed patches over them for the remainder of the day. He was released later that morning after observation. The second deputy remained at the scene until the car could be secured. He noted the position of the vehicle across the road and the absence of any other tire tracks or debris. Johnson's description stayed consistent. A bright light had approached from ahead, entered or struck the car, and left him unconscious. He offered no further details about shape or origin. The hospital report listed the eye injury as similar to welder's burns, an effect sometimes seen after sudden intense light exposure at night. The clocks became the detail people remembered because it felt impossible to place inside an ordinary crash. A dashboard clock can fail, a wristwatch can lose time, but the record says both were off by 14 minutes after the encounter, and Johnson was known for keeping his watch synchronized with the car. That does not prove what happened on the road. It does make the timeline harder to flatten into a simple fender bender. The same car that rolled hundreds of feet after contact also carried a small time discrepancy in two separate places. By daylight, the scene lost some of the fear but not the confusion. Investigators could look at the road, the tires, the glass, and the direction of travel. They could ask whether Johnson had swerved, whether another vehicle had clipped him, whether he had struck an animal, or whether the car had simply gone out of control. Each ordinary explanation had to account for the same cluster of details: the left side damage, the bent antennas, the eye burns, the clocks, and the absence of another obvious impact source. The 1977 Ford LTD was towed to the sheriff's garage for examination. The windshield crack originated on the driver's side and ran the full height of the glass. 4 small distinct marks appeared along the fracture line, each roughly circular. The left headlight lens was broken while the right remained intact. The hood dent measured about half an inch across and sat flat, as if something had pressed downward rather than struck at speed. Both antennas were displaced from their normal upright positions, yet the mounting bases showed no signs of being sheared or pulled free by wind or impact. The dome light on the roof had been displaced and its wiring showed signs of heat. Investigators measured the distance the car had rolled after the initial contact. They found no paint transfer, no fragments of another vehicle, and no soil disturbance that would indicate the car had left the pavement and returned. The damage remained confined to the left front quadrant and the upper surfaces. No corresponding marks appeared on the road surface itself. Ford engineers later examined the windshield and noted that the fracture pattern suggested forces acting both inward and outward in quick succession, though they could not identify the mechanism. The antennas showed bends that began several inches above their bases, consistent with localized stress rather than a broadside impact. The car's electrical system was checked for shorts or surges. Nothing explained the simultaneous slowing of both the dashboard clock and Johnson's mechanical wristwatch. The vehicle was returned to limited use for a time but was eventually taken out of service. Every visible mark stayed exactly as it had been photographed in the days after the event. The windshield is one of the more stubborn pieces. A windshield can crack from a rock, an animal strike, a sudden twist in the frame, or a driver hitting it from inside during a crash. But this one carried multiple small impact points along a long driver's side fracture. UFO Archive summaries describe a Ford windshield specialist, noting forces that did not look like a clean, simple strike from one direction. That is not the same as proof of an exotic object. It is only a reason the car kept getting passed from one examiner to another, instead of being written off as routine damage. The antennas gave investigators a different kind of puzzle. Wind bends an antenna backward from speed or impact. A branch can whip one down. The reports describe bends that started above the bases, with one antenna displaced sharply while another part of the car's normal antenna setup was not damaged in the same way. That selective damage is why electrical field language entered the file. Something seemed to have acted locally, as if only certain metal pieces were being stressed. Even then, the vehicle was not magic. It was a county Ford with ordinary steel, glass, wiring lamps, and a tired law enforcement interior. That is what makes it useful. You can strip away the television reenactments and still have a physical object. A car was on the road before 2 a.m. Minutes later, that same car was sideways, damaged, and tied to a deputy who needed medical attention. Any explanation has to start there. Sheriff Dennis Brekke directed the initial inquiry. The Air Force and the FAA both reported no aircraft, military or civilian, scheduled or in distress in the area at that hour. Center for UFO Studies personnel arrived within days and took magnetometer readings along the vehicle and at the reported point of first contact. The readings showed no consistent anomaly that could be separated from ordinary background variation. A Honeywell engineer, Roland Wardell, examined the antennas in the electrical system. He noted that an intense, localized electrical field could account for the antenna bends and the apparent heat at the dome light, though he did not identify the source of such a field. Later review by investigators associated with the National Investigations Committee on Aerial Phenomena suggested ball lightning as one possible natural explanation capable of producing sudden bright light, localized heating, and brief loss of consciousness. No physical residue or foreign material was recovered from the car or the roadway. Johnson himself stated only that a bright light had entered or struck the vehicle. He did not describe any craft or occupants. Crash mechanics were also considered, yet the pattern of coasting marks in the absence of any opposing vehicle or fixed object left the sequence difficult to reconstruct under ordinary impact physics. The lack of definitive laboratory proof remained a central point for skeptics. Magnetic tests produced no repeatable signature. No weather records showed thunderstorms or conditions favorable to ball lightning at that hour. The eye injury and the time discrepancy stood as physical facts, but neither could be traced to a documented source. Investigators closed the case without assigning a single cause. The Air Force and FAA angle did not solve it either. When Sheriff Brekke checked for aircraft, the answer that came back was not a hidden flight plan or a reported emergency landing. No scheduled or reported aircraft explained what Johnson thought he might be seeing. That matters only in a limited way. It does not prove the light was impossible. It only removes the first explanation Johnson himself had reached for in the moment. CUFOS brought a different kind of attention. Their investigators were interested precisely because the witness was a trained deputy and the object had apparently left a vehicle behind. But the magnetic readings did not produce a clean signature that could be held up as a solved clue. The more careful version is frustrating. Investigators found enough to keep looking, not enough to close the file. The Honeywell examination is often repeated because it sounds decisive, but it should be handled carefully. The engineer reportedly said an electrical force or thing could explain some of the damage. That is an engineering observation, not a passport stamp from another world. It leaves the biggest question untouched. Where did such a force come from on an empty road? Why did it meet the car at that moment, and why did the damage arrange itself the way it did? Ball lightning sits in the same uncomfortable middle ground. It can be bright, sudden, electrical, and difficult to document. It can appear low to the ground and vanish quickly. If any natural explanation belongs in the conversation, ball lightning belongs there. But the fit is not perfect. The reports do not give investigators a storm to point at, and ball lightning does not neatly explain every mark on the car, the long roll, the clock discrepancy, and Johnson's memory gap all at once. After the initial attention subsided, the county retained the vehicle rather than returning it to regular service. Title was eventually transferred to the Marshall County Historical Society. The car now sits in the museum at Warren, its damaged headlight and cracked windshield preserved under glass. Visitors can walk around the vehicle and see the bent antennas and the hood dent from the same angles the investigators once photographed. Johnson returned to duty but avoided public discussion of the night. He told interviewers years later that he had seen a light and felt its effects, nothing more. The town still points out the stretch of Highway 220 where the incident occurred, though the fields on either side have changed little since 1979. The car became part of local memory without requiring any larger explanation. Annual displays at the county fair drew people who remembered the original news coverage. The museum kept the vehicle in its original damaged condition, allowing later visitors to examine the same marks that had been measured and photographed in 1979. Johnson himself moved on to other law enforcement work and later retired out of state. He continued to describe the event in the same limited terms he had used from the beginning. The attention was not harmless. Once the story left Marshall County, Johnson became the man people wanted to turn into a symbol. UFO believers wanted a clean law enforcement witness. Skeptics wanted a weak point. Television wanted a reenactment. Local reporters wanted to know whether he still stood by what he said. Through all of it, his answer stayed smaller than the legend around him. He saw a ball of light, he drove toward it, then it was in the car with him, and he could not explain the damage that followed. That is why the museum car works better than any dramatic retelling. It does not ask the viewer to believe in a spaceship. It asks them to look at the ordinary object that survived the night. The cracked windshield is not an argument. The bent antennas are not a confession. The slow clocks are not a conclusion. They are pieces left on the table after every easy version of the story has already been tried. The physical record remains the same set of marks and measurements taken in the days after the event. The car coasted 854 feet before stopping at a right angle to the road. Both timepieces lost 14 minutes. The eye injury matched exposure to intense light, yet no source of that light was identified on the ground or in the air. The damage clustered on the left side and upper surfaces without corresponding marks on the pavement or on any other vehicle. Ball lightning remains one offered explanation, yet no storm was present and no thunder was reported. An electrical event of unknown origin fits some of the antenna and heat damage, yet leaves the origin of the light and the precise timing unexplained. The vehicle itself, still on display, carries the only physical traces that have not been accounted for by any conventional sequence of events. A fake story usually tries to get bigger with age. This one stayed narrow. A deputy, a light, broken glass, burned eyes, bent metal, missing minutes, and a car that ended up in a museum. That narrowness is the reason it still feels uncomfortable. The details are not enough to prove an extraordinary answer, but they are too specific to dismiss with a shrug, so the cleanest ending is the same one Johnson seemed to live with. Something happened on Highway 220 before dawn on August 27, 1979. It damaged a patrol car and hurt the deputy inside it. The official record kept circling natural explanations, electrical possibilities, and crash mechanics, but no single answer carried the whole load. Decades later, the Ford is still there in Warren, waiting under museum lights, holding onto the shape of a night nobody has fully explained.